Welcome to Phenomenon Radio, the show that covers thought-provoking breakthroughs in the fields of UAP UFOs to discover fascinating truths, first-hand accounts, and investigative insights into the expanding confluence of physical and mental exposure to this worldwide phenomenon. Hosted by world-renowned experiencer of the 1980 Rendlesham Bentwaters UFO incident, John Burroughs, and Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist, Moulton Howe. And now, leading off the program, here's Moulton Howe.
A month ago, on July 11th, 2015, an audience gathered at the Woodbridge, England Community Hall to hear updates about the RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge unidentified aerial phenomena in Rendlesham Forest 35 years ago. One of the speakers was the former deputy base commander. Before the Woodbridge audience, Colonel Halt announced, quote, "I have confirmation that Bentwaters radar operators saw an object go across their 60-mile radar scope in 2 or 3 seconds. That's thousands of miles an hour. The object came back across their scope again, stopped near the water tower. They watched it and observed it go into the forest where we were. At Wattisham, radar operators picked up what they called a bogey and lost it near Rendlesham Forest. Whatever was there was clearly under intelligent control," close quote. One important eyewitness at that same time, back in December of 1980, in addition to the radar operators, was Sergeant Rick Bobo. He was 50 feet up inside the RAF Bentwaters weapons storage area alarm station watchtower. Sergeant Bobo was the Delta Flight WSA tower operator, and he had a clear 360-degree view of the bunkers below him, filled with tactical nuclear weapons. Those nuclear weapons on both the U.S. and U.K. sides of the big NATO air base were a highly classified top secret at the time. Sergeant Bobo also had a clear view of Rendlesham Forest running along the airbase. Sergeant Bobo's priority was to report any threat to that WSA. So to his surprise, he saw a large reddish blue light just pop in the sky and stay in the same spot, stationary, for nearly 2 hours. That big red and blue light also emitted a smaller light that sped very quickly down into Rendlesham Forest. At least twice, Sergeant Bobo phoned Central Security Control, the CSC, to alert them about the unidentified aerial phenomena. But with each call, Rick Bobo was told, quote, "The situation is under control," close quote, because there was an ongoing investigation in the forest. Apparently, that was the same December 28, 1980 night that RAF Bentwaters Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt took several men with him into the forest to investigate persistent strange lights and beams that had been in the forest the previous 2 nights. And Airman First Class John Burroughs was the only person known to have been engulfed by unidentified aerial lights on 2 of those nights, December 26th and 28th, 1980. That's when John was exposed to the UAP, UFO, or unidentified aerial phenomena, non-ionizing radiation that we discussed last week in our first Phenomenon radio broadcast with the UK's Nick Pope. Sergeant Rick Bobo even remembers hearing John Burroughs' name mentioned the night he was watching the reddish blue light outside his WSA watchtower. Like John Burroughs, Rick Bobo enlisted in the U.S. Air Force in 1979 and ended up at RAF Bentwaters in early 1980. One of the big questions Sergeant Bobo and others have had since the mysterious December 1980 lights and beams: how can the UK Ministry of Defense say repeatedly there was no defense significance to all the lights, beams, and even a craft in Rendlesham Forest, December 26th to 28th, when on at least one of those nights, after midnight on December 28th, Sergeant Bobo watched the large, unidentified aerial object right over the Bentwaters WSA without central security control, calling for an entire base alert. Since the 1960s, UFOs have interfered with Minuteman bases in the United States. They have even shut down nuclear missiles underground in a UFO show apparently of controlled force. What was all the UFO UAP phenomena that was tracked on radar into Rendlesham Forest? And what were those UAP UFOs doing near the RAF Bentwaters WSA? Even shooting a beam down so close to Colonel Halt's shoes that he wondered if it were an act of aggression by the unidentified intelligence controlling the aerial lights and beams. In an interview that I did with Sergeant Bobo in April 2010, he described seeing a full moon-sized blue and red light from his WSA glass tower.
It looked really big, and there was red and blue, and I did see something come down from it and went down into the woods.
Was the big light still up in the air?
Oh, yes, yes.
So it's up in the air, and something went from it down into Rendlesham Forest.
Yes. And there could have been more than one thing come down from it that evening.
Okay, and how long were you able to see that reddish-blue large light?
Oh, goodness. It was there a long time. It just sat there. It didn't go anywhere. It just sat in one spot. I think you could have put a crosshair on it, and it never would have moved. I was maybe 50 feet in the air. I could see a lot.
How high do you think the red-blue object was?
It was much higher than I was.
300 or 400 feet above the forest, or?
I would say at least.
What was the color of the light that left and went down into the forest?
Boy, I tell you, it was just like a ship going down, leaving a streak or something, you know what I mean?
Moving really fast.
Oh, yeah, down really fast.
From you standing up in the WSA tower at Bentwaters, in your mind's eye, would that red-blue light have been something like the size of a full moon to a human mind?
Harvest full moon, you know, where it looks really big, or It was a large object.
Did you ever see any beams of light come down from the bluish-red large light into either the Bentwaters weapons storage area, RAF Woodbridge weapons storage?
Nothing came into Bentwaters. All right, just so you know that. Nothing came into the Bentwaters storage area.
Did you say to anybody, I think that we have an urgent situation with this unidentified that is large, that is just hanging outside of this tower?
Just through the CSC, I have an object in the sky. I can't identify it. It's got red and blue lights. It's sitting stationary. It just appeared. My main concern was that WSA.
Why I'm asking about the beam down into the Bentwaters weapons storage area where the nuclear weapons were, Colonel Halt said that during that night, when they were in the forest, they had a beam come down very close to them, and he said it looked like in the distance, in the direction of the Bentwaters WSA, that more beams were being shot down then as well.
Not into the WSA.
Well, that's an important piece.
I was in the tower. It didn't happen. It may have appeared so from where he was. I could see that. But nothing came in that WSA. Not unless it took all memory of it away from all of us that were in there.
I understand what you're saying.
Because it would not have been a small thing. It would have been a rather large thing to have happened.
From your perspective, being in the WSA tower at Bentwaters, was the big red-blue unidentified parked right over the weapons storage area?
No. No. I was looking out over the WSA area. I did have some radio traffic that I could catch. I could hear them talking about things in the woods and lights in the woods and things bumping in the trees.
Do you think it was Colonel Halt's investigation?
It was somebody investigating. I couldn't tell you who was absolutely there. I believe Burroughs was out there at the time. Maybe somebody mentioned his name. I know there was quite a few people out there. I think they even had Geiger counters out there.
Well, it sounds that this occurred on the night that Colonel Halt and John Burroughs was there. A lot of people were there. And that sounds like this is the night that you saw this object.
Well, it probably was.
And you're in the Bentwaters WSA. Did you all have any formal or informal gathering to discuss what had happened?
Nope. I was never talked to about it. Ever.
Not by anyone?
Not by anyone.
And yet you were watching this big red-blue light that was hovering close enough for you to see it?
Yes, and making radio transmissions about it. And there was somebody that came up in my tower, but I don't know who he was. I don't know where he was from. I don't know what organization he was with. He came up looking through a scope. I didn't get to look at the scope. I don't know who he was or what department he was with. I could make an assumption, but it would just be an assumption.
What would your assumption be?
OSI.
Was he civilian or Air Force dressed?
No, he was military. I just don't know what department he was from.
What kind of scope was he looking at the red-blue light with?
Just like a spotting scope, which would have given very good magnification.
Did he make any comments to you?
No, we didn't speak.
Wow.
Well, he didn't speak.
You tried to speak.
I'm sure I tried to speak, but he didn't. So what do you do?
Well, did you try to explain to him that you had seen a light leave the big red-blue light and go
I'm
down?
sure I gave him every bit of information I had. Nobody else came up the tower. I had to let him up because I had my gate closed. Nobody could come up without me allowing it.
How long did he stay there?
15, 20 minutes maybe.
And when he left, he just left and didn't say anything to you?
So he just left. Gone.
From your perspective, did you see this big red-blue light only one night?
I believe the only time I saw it was one night. I know they had problems other times because people said so.
And no one ever debriefed you?
No one ever spoke to me.
30 years later, it was on June 25th, 2009, that the former deputy base commander at RAF Bentwaters, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, went on the record in a press release that said that the lights that he and others saw in December of 1980 were, quote, extraterrestrial in origin, close quote. What is your reaction to that press release comment?
I'd have to agree because I think it'd be pretty arrogant to think in all the vastness of what's out there in our universe and other universes that we're the only living, halfway intelligent beings there are.
If there were extraterrestrials in advanced craft interacting with Rendlesham Forest for at least 3 nights, possibly longer, why do you think that our government in the U.S. and the U.K. government seem to have a policy of denial about it?
They've always denied everything like that, haven't they? Don't the governments always think they know what's best for everybody?
One military man who has investigated phenomena such as remote viewing in his 32-year career in the U.S. Army is retired 77-year-old Colonel John B. Alexander. Colonel Alexander is author of The Warrior's Edge in 1990, Future War, Non-Lethal Weapons in Modern Warfare in 1999, Winning the War, Advanced Weapons, Strategies and Concepts for the Post-9/11 World in 2003, and most recently in 2011, UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies and Realities. Colonel Alexander was also the Army intelligence officer who explored the use of psychokinesis and psychic abilities to try to improve soldiers and their ability to collect intelligence. It was that research in the human mind that led to the Hollywood movie The Men Who Stare at Goats. Actor George Clooney played a character loosely based on Colonel Alexander's experimentations with human minds exerting control over their environment, including being able to kill or injure goats in mind over matter exercises. Colonel Alexander joins us on this Phenomenon radio broadcast next, after a short break, to talk about how remote viewing has worked to penetrate mysteries in past, present, and future timelines, and his perspective about the defense significance of the light and beam phenomena and that UAP non-ionizing radiation that damaged John Burroughs' eyes and heart in December 1980.
Ladies and gentlemen, with that, we'll be right back to start the second segment of Phenomenon Radio Live with special guest John B. Alexander right after these messages. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Phenomenon Radio right here on KGRAradio.com. Just about to kick off the interview with John B. Alexander. And with that, I give you Linda Moulton Howe.
Thank you. And John Alexander, thank you for joining John Burroughs and me on this, our second Phenomenon Radio broadcast. And before the break, we heard Sergeant Rick Bobo from RAF Bentwaters and his experiences back in December 1980 describe this large, full moon-looking red-blue UFO near the Bentwaters Tactical Nuke Weapons Storage. And it was not too long ago that Lord and Admiral Peter John Hill Norton, former UK Chief of Defense Staff and Chairman of the NATO Military Committee, said in a 2000 television interview about RAF Bentwaters specifically, quote, "There are objects in our atmosphere which are technically miles in advance of anything that we can deploy, that we have no means of stopping them coming here, and that we have no defense against them should they be hostile. I believe governments fear that if they did disclose those facts, people would panic," close quote, Lord Hill Norton. But the question that seems to me that we, John and I and others, are trying to focus on and understand is, with the Sergeant Bobo at the Bentwaters WSA seeing obvious objects from someplace else that he didn't understand near the weapons storage area, and Lord Hill Norton's own comments about RAF Bentwater, how is it possible that the Ministry of Defense, in some of its documents, has insisted that this was an event not of defense significance, when it would appear that from December 26th on in 1980, all of what was happening at RAF Bentwaters and Woodbridge was of defense significance for both the UK and the US? Could you give us your insights from all of your Army career and your interests in high strangeness and the UFO phenomena about RAF Bentwaters and why the MOD, in spite of the facts, would have continued to insist that it was not of defense significance?
I guess you'd have to ask the RAF and MOD that question. I can't really address that. I'm familiar with the case. I think it's one of the best examples out there because of physical evidence, number of witnesses, credibility of witnesses, and things of that nature. But as you know, John is first-hand witness. All I am is somebody who's listened to a lot of the stories. So.
But would you then put it in the category of defense significance?
It's hard to say. See, one of the problems, and what you're doing here is isolating that case. And again, I think it's a really good case. But what the researchers tend to do is to stack up, and things like what you mentioned, Malmstrom, the incidents, the missiles being shut down, and there's been a number of interactions over the years, certainly the Iranian case is ideal. There's great testimony coming out of the former Soviet Union. But when you amortize those over, the globe and half a century, actually more than that now, they're really very, very rare events. Chuck and I have had discussions about the investigation. I think what you said with Sergeant Bobo is kind of very interesting, and that is nobody talked to him. I would think that if it were of major concern, that you would be gathering up everybody and doing in-depth debriefs, and there's ways to do that, even with if they've had access to information that somebody's concerned about. The thing where I would disagree with Hill Norton and many, many others on, and you can take it, is that this notion that if we tell the public, you'll scare them too badly. I think, they can handle it. They certainly have taken on a lot of worse things. And as I pointed out, the vast majority of the American public think UFOs are real anyway. That we don't know it, that's something we can discuss. Understanding the technologies and things involved, I think, are areas worth pursuing.
Well, would you now then agree with what Colonel Charles Halt said at the June 25th, 2009 press conference he did in England and released that statement that said, "I believe the objects that I saw at close quarters were extraterrestrial in origin, and that the security services of both the United States and England were and have been complicit in trying to subvert the significance of what occurred at Rendlesham by use of well-practiced methods of disinformation," close quote.
I'd certainly agree that that's his opinion.
From your perspective, if what Colonel Halt told John and me in Washington is correct, that the National Security Agency of the United States took over the RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge investigation within 24 hours of December 26th, that is Colonel Halt telling us that, then it would explain perhaps why some people were not debriefed, because the National Security Agency already had information. From your experiences,
the people who were not debriefed included him. So I'm sorry, these are not making sense to me.
Which part is not making sense?
Well, you're talking about all these key people, all of whom have, quote, not been debriefed. So who was debriefed?
John, I think that Colonel Halt was debriefed, wasn't he, with Conrad and some?
To the best of my knowledge, no. And, he and I have had some discussions online and offline about that. And in fact, when he was getting ready to leave the Air Force, he even asked about, well, don't you want to, because of clearances, what you do is you clear up any tickets that you may be holding and whatnot, and I asked him, don't you want to know that? He said they just kind of laughed. No.
John Burroughs, didn't you have firsthand information or interview knowledge that Colonel Halt was involved in some of the interviews with you guys?
Well, as far as that goes, Sergeant Peniston said that he was brought in numerous times and talked to by Colonel Halt and other people within OSI. But Colonel, I'd like to go down a little bit of a different road. I see where she's going and where you're going. Well, okay, let's start from the beginning. All right, Colonel Halt.
Let's be clear. I don't have any firsthand information about Bentwaters.
No, I understand, but I'm not trying to get into
that's...
right. I'm not trying to get in directly into Bentwaters now. What I'm trying to do is get it from a military's perspective. Okay, you were a colonel. You were a Green Beret. You were special operations, right? Bentwaters, and then I'll get into the nuclear missiles that were shut down. The report I've heard you talk about. Okay, we had an incident. It happened over 3 days. The last day, a team went out. and it was ordered out by, according to Colonel Halt, by the base commander. He goes out with the team. Geiger counters the whole thing. It goes to the command post. There's verification there was radar contact. Okay, afterwards, different people said they've been talked to and debriefed. Where I'm going with this is, in your experience as a military officer, if you led a team or you did something like that, afterwards there would be a debriefing, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so in essence...
And you would know, and you may at the end get to sign a paper that says, non-disclosure, you're not going to talk about this anymore.
Okay, so,
But
and then if you sign... Right, and if you sign a non-disclosure saying you can't talk about it unless you're cleared, right? And that means you're cleared. Now, they can clear you to talk about certain things, correct?
Right.
Okay, so he goes along, he goes out, and that's why I'm bringing up the debriefing part. It just, when he says he never was debriefed, he took a team off base. OSI would at least want to talk to him about it. You know, at the minimum, after he took a team off base, by order of the base commander, the wing commander knew about it. He was on the radio, the whole thing. So after the incident...
Well, let's distinguish between talking about things and being debriefed.
Okay, all right, go ahead.
I mean, you had an incident that was, as I understand it, a lot of buzz on the base, correct?
Yes, afterwards,
so
yes.
So the notion that they would talk about it is one thing. To me, formal debriefing is something quite different.
Okay, that's fair. But what I mean by debrief is he even hinted that they took the tape, took it to the wing commander took it to 3rd Air Force and all that. But I guess my next line is this, okay, you've talked about the missiles being shut down, correct?
Right.
Or something's come in and shut the missiles down.
Absolutely real and very significant, yes.
Okay, so now, good, great. So that's real, it's significant, all right? And what I'm trying to tie this into is when that kind of stuff goes on, that has to be of defense significance, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. In your book, you talked about different agencies investigating different things, okay? So let's take out, for now, the alien presence, because that's one of the things when you start speculating on exactly what it was. But you have something that's able to come into our airspace, deactivate our weapons, and once that happens, go through the scenario, what would happen after that?
I can see here's where you're going, and here's the problem. Let's look at Malmstrom, because that's somewhat different. Absolutely happened. Absolutely was certainly of significance. It was not ignored. The people looked at it in significant detail and came up with what the hell. Could not come up with any answer or explanation for how that incident worked. Now, the problem from the other side of the fence is one of resources, and that is how much time, effort, money, etc. are you going to spend trying to find the answer to something that you're probably not going to get an answer to. The answer in that case was, okay, we've seen this, let's wait. If it happens again, we'll get a lot more serious. And, of course, it didn't in the U.S. There's the case that I mentioned in the book and the Soviet case. It was very, very significant as well. They did the similar thing. They looked at it in considerable detail, came up with the same answer, have no idea what this is, but you can't go on, researching things forever because there's an infinite amount of things to research. And so you're really in a resource management issue, from the macro level. Intense interest from the people involved, but when you say, what are you going to commit to that?
Okay, fair enough. Now, my next thing would be what agencies would have gotten involved in that? Who would have looked at it and,
Well, I don't know, but it struck me that I heard you mention NSA, and that it strikes me as would be outside their purview. They would be, the last folks that I would have estimated. But
that was coming from Colonel Halt to John and me directly.
I understand that. I still maintain this is not an agency that I would have expected involvement to do with their mission whatsoever.
And Colonel Halt told me in a recorded interview that after he had retired from his last work in the Pentagon, that he knew a longtime military friend working over in Fort Meade in NSA and called him and said, "It's been a lot of years. I would really like to see the NSA file you have in RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge." And he said he went over there. The man let him in and took a look and said, here was about 3 feet of files. And the Colonel Halt said, well, I would like to read them. And the man said, well, you can't. You don't have access to them, but I'm showing this is what we have. And that if the NSA took over, it means that the National Security Agency must have had some Trump pecking order relationship to what was happening in the UK and the US at Woodbridge. And it would also, I think it would explain...
Well, we had listening stations and we had a very close relationship with the UK. So they certainly had resources there and throughout Europe. But you got to remember, this is the bad old days. This is the days of the Soviet Union. And lots of resources there. If he's got it, like I say, you've got to ask Chuck about that or NSA, because I haven't seen those files. I can't say they do or do not exist.
Did you ever, in all of your remote viewing research, did you ever target what happened in RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge?
Well, first, I wasn't directly involved in it, but I do not know of any of the remote viewers that use that as a target. No.
1986.
What was it that was remote?
It was Buchanan, I believe Buchanan and I can't think of the other guy's name now. Ed Dames actually did a remote view on the site. It's actually been declassified by the CIA, is out there and available to look at now.
And what was their bottom line?
I'm not a guy that could read it. What I would be interested in hearing is if Colonel Alexander ever did have a chance to look at it, his opinion on it. But there's some things in there based on some people I've talked to that understand a little bit about remote viewing, that there was definitely some activity that went on between the people out there and whatever showed up. So
yeah, I have not seen those files. They're probably in the big stack that's been released. Where I get into a lot of trouble with the remote viewing community is when I say, sometimes it's accurate. The people inside would like to make claims that I think are hard to justify as to just what the degree of accuracy is. So it'd be interesting, and as you mentioned it, I'll go, I think I know where I can find them, and since that's all out now.
Well,
okay,
John, if I can just ask something.
There were several who were interested in the UFO phenomenon. Now, they always indicated that any of the remote viewing sessions dealing with that were, quote, training sessions, i.e. they were never specifically targeted by, the people who were providing targets to the group.
In your book, The Warrior's Edge, you have on page 136 a fascinating statement. Remote viewers gather information as effectively from the future or the past as they do from the present. And in that context, I wondered what your own perspective, working a long time in remote viewing, is of Jim Penniston, who was next to John in the Rendlesham Forest, having the binary download and some sort of a telepathic download that the black 7 by 9 foot glassy triangle that appeared out in the forest, John has never been able to remember because he has total amnesia about it. But Jim Penniston says that the black glassy triangle that emerged out of a bright white light in the forest and that he dragged his fingers over raised symbols and got the binary code. And the telepathic impression was that these were time travelers, that this was a time travel machine because of some sort of problem in a distant future. In all of the work that you've done in remote viewing, have you come across something where you've got we'll call it a disconnect between the present and the future that collide in a phenomena like what happened in RAF Bentwaters?
I guess the short answer would be no. What I was talking about in the book was examples of precognitive and retrocognitive remote viewing targets. The precog ones were done in which they had the remote viewers assigned to a target that had yet to be selected, and then a person, outbound viewer, go and view them at some time in the future, usually within a day or so. And they were able to come up with a lot of detailed information about it. The critical issue in remote viewing targets is that it is in fact observed. I have a lot of problems and have talked to the time traveler thing. I don't know, and there's lots of work being done now on retrocausation. In other words, being able to go back and cause events in the past to change. But having said that, I've also said if anybody could continuously and accurately, go into the future even 1 second, we would know who they are because they could literally own the world. And so when you get these talks about big leaps and going, X number of years or months or something like that, to say that I'm skeptical is sort of an understatement.
Well, this also parallels a lot of what we're fascinated with in the Project Condign. That's the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Report that the MOD's DI-55 and DI-52 handed over to the MOD in December 2000, and then very quietly, no publicity, it was unclassified in 2006. And there are several paragraphs in this 460 pages that specifically are describing a non-ionizing radiation. Frequencies either are not known or are puzzling because you cannot get something defined in the report. But it raises this very substantial issue, both to what we were just talking about in remote viewing, what happened to John and Jim and everybody in the Rendlesham Forest, and that is the sections having to do with mental manipulation of human minds by this mysterious non-ionizing radiation from unidentified aerial phenomena. Have you, in any of your work, dealt with this issue of a physical frequency or radiation that could manipulate minds?
I'm not sure what you're talking about here. If you're talking about overt mind control, it's certainly a lot of stuff in the conspiracy theory.
Have you read that Project Condign, the pages about the sections, mental impact, and it's talking about ionizing radiation?
Well, there's lots of reports come out about, and if you look at a lot of the contacts or contactee literature and talk to those people, they frequently talk about having, usually it's not mediated by a device or radiation, as you're calling it, as opposed to direct mind-to-mind communication kinds of things, i.e. mental telepathy, and not just a knowingness, but an ability to transfer thought. And that goes back, hundreds of years. This is one of my comments when we get into the issues of meeting with entities and whatnot. I think that little guys coming out of flying saucers is, in general, relatively new and localized when you compare it with interactions between humans and sentient non-humans that have been reported globally, throughout human history. So the notion that the UFO was there, frankly, to me, is sort of an interesting sidelight. The bigger issue is what the hell's going on with, experiences with, sentient non-human entities.
Interactions that go back and have been written about in 5,000 years ago, even.
Yes. Well, that's the point. But connecting it to a UFO, doing it, in general, is relatively new. Some of the cases in Jacques' last book goes back, thousands of years. But the interactions as described, I just finished 2 days ago reviewing a book looking at interactions between UFO abductions and fairies and Sasquatch and things of that nature, and pointing out, again, these interactions have been reported consistently.
And in many cases, all are in the same phenomena event. I have encountered...
Well, here's, I've got a slide, and I think you've probably seen it, but I use it in all of my briefings, and it starts with, it has UFOs, but it's also got remote viewing and psychokinesis and cryptozoology, near-death experience, firewalking, etc. And my point is that I think we do a disservice when we try to look at these phenomena in isolation, because I do think there's a more fundamental issue and a connection, and consciousness is probably part of that connection. And I don't think that we're very close to, coming up with answers. You tend to want to ask or get concrete answers to specific phenomena. Things I'm interested in are, I think, far more broader than that. I just had dinner last night with a guy by the name of Stu Hammeroff, who's an anesthesiologist who has explored these things and comes up with something called proto-consciousness, and suggesting that at a very, very deep level, this proto-consciousness is there, and through that you can have these physical interactions and connections and move both forward and backwards in both time and space.
But there are too many eyewitnesses, whether it's civilian, military, or intel, that over the years, some before they have died with nothing to gain, have described being in the presence of non-humans. And those three categories of the grays, the blondes, and something reptilian have persisted over eons, really. And that if you come to where the government of the United States and the UK since World War II, where they have been in their policies of denial, it always has a subcontext of, and it's in their own documents, extraterrestrial biological entities. And that acronym has been there in documents that have been leaked to us in the research community.
But they're dealing with the same problem, and that is have no idea what's going on, that you would come out with the extraterrestrial hypothesis is a normal first run. I sort of went down that route for many years until I got to the point of looking at it from a broader context and saying that's simply too simple. We get to the government issues. I keep pointing out that two things to remember. One is that interest by individuals in the government is very different from institutional interest and responsibility. We know, I mean, this is only one case. We know that a significant proportion, about 7% of the adult population, believe they've seen a UFO. That holds true for government personnel as well. So you've got people there who've had personal experiences that cannot and should not be denied. But I've always pointed out there is no Department of Good Ideas. There are things to research. There's, you've probably seen my stuff doing the numbers, looking at the cost. You say this is the military background. But you're looking at it, it's a zero-sum game. What are you going to research? Where are you going to go that gives you the most potential for results? This is not, and this is the problem that they have, is it's really not an area that's very promising in coming up with the results. I mean, these enigmas are certainly fascinating, but the probability of coming up with answers, I think, is quite low. And this is why I've argued. And the last paragraph of my book says, excuse me, whatever this is, it is more complex than we can possibly imagine, or maybe could imagine.
And John,
we're at the point of asking the right questions, let alone getting simple answers.
There are people who have worked in military and intelligence, as you have, who have, we'll say, behind the scenes, that they have leaked information, and they refer to an alien presence, and the implication is something that is not Homo sapiens sapien, that has been on this planet perhaps for 270 million years, and has
cryptoids. Yeah, the potential for cryptoids, and you will find a few individuals who suggest that.
Well, what I was just going to ask you is, if I'm hearing what you are saying and what they have said, what begins to crystallize in my mind is that there is an alien presence somehow beneath the surface of this planet, and may have its own base stations on the moon and throughout this solar system in ways that we don't understand, but that it would precede standing up primates such as Homo sapiens sapien. Are you familiar with this line of description?
Yeah, that is a premise that certainly a number of people have. My point would be that the things, I just have problems with the extraterrestrial hypothesis. By the way, one of the interesting things in this book that I thought the guy had a point on was in saying that the events are orchestrated in such a way that they are, if not understandable, at least acceptable to the suspects, victims, perceivers, if you will. In other words, the entire event is being manipulated, and that's why you get some of these differences, but it's based on what the perceiver can experience and tolerate.
And if it's other dimensions...
And it may push their buttons. I mean, understand, it may be quite a ways out. But,
if it is other dimensions, haven't some of the remote viewers over the last 30 or 40 years, they have remote viewed and have felt that they are in another dimension and that it was quite dissettling?
Oh, people do that. I mean, that, again, we're now almost into folklore, but people have been doing these things forever.
Which part forever?
Having the kinds of experiences that you're talking about. Many of we talked about experience with sentient non-human beings, but many of them engage, take like Rip Van Winkle, which is a story many people know. There's an example of somebody goes into a suspended basically suspended animation in other spaces. Folklore is replete with experiences where people say they went to another realm and stayed for X period of time, or came back thinking that it was a relatively short period of time, only to find out that time in our dimensions had moved on, days, weeks, or years. Look at the Travis Walton case as kind of an example of that.
In the sense that he was gone for 5 days
Right.
in terms of our time, but for him, he had no idea whether it was a minute or 3 minutes.
Correct.
Or hours, yeah.
That's a good example.
Well, we're going to go into a break here. When we come back, I'd like to bring up another piece out of the amazing Condign report. And John Burroughs, I know, will have a lot of questions after this break.
Thank you, Linda. We'll wrap the first hour of Phenomenon Radio Live with our very special guest, John Alexander. Folks, you can follow us and like us on Facebook. Just search Phenomenon Radio. We would appreciate you to go by and give us a like. You can also find more on the program at phenomenonradio.com and earthfiles.com. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to KGRA's presentation of Phenomenon Radio Live with your host, John Burroughs and Linda Moulton Howe, and special guest, John B. Alexander. And with that, I give you John Burroughs to bring us back to hour 2.
Thanks, Race. Colonel, the last hour, one of the things I picked up, you were talking about remote viewing. You made a statement that said that when you do the remote viewing, if someone figures out how, and I would assume you mean remote influence, to look into the future and affect the future, they would control everything. You did say that, correct?
No, I was talking, that would be true, but I was really talking about this notion of time travel. If you read, in particularly conspiracy theory websites and all, you hear about people are going backwards and forwards a year and whatnot. My point is that there are enough supercomputers out there that give stock traders an advantage in a few hundredths of a second, which is sufficient to have them make money very consistently, not 100% of the time, but they can predict the course. And my point was, if you had something that was accurate to 1 second, that's where you'd go. You'd be predicting the future, and you can make literally a gazillion dollars.
Okay, so
MUFON would own the world.
Expanding on that again. Okay, so when you remote viewed, you did go to the future, correct? That was part of what they would do. They would be given coordinates to look at the future,
were
correct?
times they could do it. Now, we're dealing with, we're talking about accuracy here. You get a percentage of the time, and I'll argue that these folks, particularly ones selling remote viewing courses, tend to exaggerate the accuracy. The other thing to remember, this is not something as simple. Remote viewing is actually a lot of work. And when you start talking about going into the future, the amount of effort that goes into a specific session, say to see a target tomorrow, is probably going to be several hours and maybe multiple sessions. It's not like you flip a switch and say,
But in theory, though, and this is what I've asked other people that have been involved in the program off the air. Okay, if you actually can confirm it, and they told me different ways they did it was had more than one group do it, and when several groups came to a consensus, unknowing what the other group said, that it looked like that was a good probability. But if you could go to a target and see something in the future, could you not then influence the present going forward to that moment?
That's the theory in retrocausation. The answer is, you probably can do that, and there's some very preliminary research being done to explore those sorts of issues. And we're at the front end of this research. This is not, again, the conspiracy theory where you see them, having, perfected this process and causing everything to happen. So
I understand. Now, one of the things that I picked up from Kana, and I know Lynn's going to go to a little more, but one of the questions I have to ask, I've noticed that quite a few of you have done different research. You were involved with Robert Bigelow, you were up at Skinwalker, you were on NIDS. But one of the things that I've noticed, and Dr. Persinger out of Canada was involved in this, and one of the things that I noticed, and I think this will lead into Linda's going into Kana a little bit more, is there's been a lot of interest, including the God's Helmet, that Dr. Persinger developed, that has to do with frequencies affecting the mind, which goes back to earlier what you were saying, on what you see, what you perceive, and possibly even being able to, leave this dimension or whatever. So that adds into, is time travel going to be physical, or is it going to be in a different way? And then I'll, if you can answer that, I'll Linda go into a little bit more on the Condyne.
Well, got any simple questions?
No, but this is something that.
Good question, John.
Yeah.
Well, the answer is that there's obviously things that can be done. Now, you've got a couple of different approaches. Let's take Bob Monroe as a classic example. He's the guy who wrote Journeys Out of the Body, from the Monroe Institute. And one of the things, what they do down there is you go into a check chamber. They use the audio frequencies, hemisync. Now, privately, he was exploring a lot of other aspects. Again, he was. Most people don't know it. He was actually an electrical engineer and had been a vice president of MBS, Mutual Broadcasting System, from antiquity. But the point was that they were using specific things to manipulate the brain. Having said that, there's also a host of literature of people looking at meditative techniques. I might take this one step further in that what Bob was basically doing, most of the techniques that we explored for mental acuity had to do with things like meditation, and you muck around until you find the signal that you're looking for. What Bob Monroe was doing is saying, hey, I can take you there. And then using the audio frequencies to drive the brain, and internally we're looking at certain, usually alpha frequencies to create or allow certain events to happen. Now, having said that, there's also, again, another body of literature, and somewhere the conspiracy might be sort of right, looking at detrimental effects of exposure to external electromagnetic kinds of things. There's probably a good reason you don't want to build your house under high power lines, for instance. But there you're getting spurious stuff as opposed to something that's trying to, create an effect, but it ends up doing it anyway.
What John Burroughs, I think, was getting to is time travel into the future. If you are using the same, we'll call it methodology or strict discipline of remote viewing, and you have been able to remote view into the future, would this be part of the current government efforts to understand an alien presence, and that it might relate to the fact?
You're introducing several different factors here. One's a remote viewing one. One has to do with the government involvement with ET. Frankly,
accessing the future with remote viewing.
Yeah, but okay. Key issue with remote viewing is that somebody, live human being, observes the target at some point. You can have done that in the past, be doing it now, or sometime in the future. An approach that was done to this was called associative remote viewing, and people have actually made money on this. Hal Puthoff and them created a school where they wanted to build a new school for the kids, kind of an advanced approach to it. Rather than saying, what's going to happen, they were using the Silver's futures as the target. Rather than saying, is the Silver's future going to go up or down, they would say, tomorrow at the closing bell, I'm going to see an object. What object are you going to see? And then the association was, you might make a salt shaker if it goes up, or a baseball if it goes down. And so if you get things that look like a salt shaker, you say, the market's going up, so you bet accordingly. But again, it was not an absolute knowing, and a lot of effort going into doing that.
Well, the big picture question is manipulation of human minds, whether we're talking about remote viewing, accessing past, present, and future, or jumping over to Project Condign, the MOD 460-page analysis of unidentified aerial phenomena and what they emit. And I
think what Nick will tell you is that Condign report basically followed the Condon report in the U.S. For methodology and things.
No, I'm familiar with the Condign report, and I have read. I'm familiar with the Condon report, University of Colorado, and the Condign report, UK, is quite different and goes into a great deal of technical specificity about this unidentified aerial phenomena, non-ionizing radiation that they were studying in this. And the part that I wanted to read, because it is so interesting about the phenomena that we're dealing with and what you yourself, working in projects with General Stubblebine and others, trying to access and use remote viewing to understand many things, including mind over matter. Here is a brief section that I would like to have you comment on. It's page F4, Annex F, as in Frank. And this is under the heading Potential Mental Effects on Humans, and that subject is related to unidentified aerial phenomena, non-ionizing radiation that has mental effects on humans. And there are two brief sections. One, the well-reported Rendlesham Forest Bentwaters event is an example where it might be postulated that several observers were probably exposed to UAP radiation for longer than normal UAP sighting periods, implying that the UK investigators already had baselines on human exposures to unidentified aerial phenomena with certain impacts and effects. There may be other cases which remain unreported. It is clear that the recipients of these effects are not aware that their behavior perception of what they are observing is being modified. And I'm jumping now to paragraph 16 from that one. It would seem that this effect can occur when close to a UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, either outdoors or indoors. This causes the brain to interact in an unusual way with the imagination library, in quotes, causing reports of visual activity which are not, in fact, a true representation of the facts, close quote. John Burroughs has had his mind blocked since December 26th and 28th about what exactly happened to him when he was engulfed, embraced, closed by lights, their various descriptions. And others, like Colonel Halt, told me himself it scared him when one of the beams came right down within 2 to 3 feet of one of his shoes. That was a physical observation. John Burroughs was in the unidentified aerial phenomena radiation and suffered heart damage and eye damage. In all of this is a question about knowledge by governments of physical frequencies that can impact human minds on one side of the ledger, and all of the work that you and Howe and Ingo Swan did with remote viewing, which I'm assuming is independent of applying technological frequencies.
That's correct. There was no in the remote viewing. There were no exposure to any type of radiation or anything of that nature.
Has anybody talked to you about the non-ionizing radiation studied
there
in this?
are reports on NEMR that go, but most of the reports have nothing to do with aerial phenomena. I mean, they were looking at the impact of NEMR, for years and years. But I think more of concern were potential for health hazards because of things that might be generated by various devices.
And you're talking about broadband non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation, and the acronym is NEMR.
Right.
And that Kit Green has talked with John Burroughs about the impact specifically of NEMR on him in his specific situation where he had to have open heart surgery to repair these leaflets in his mitral valve, which were linked directly to knowledge that our government had about the impact of non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation on tissues such as heart and eyes. So the very fact that there is information about this non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation in medical situations means the UK and the US governments have a lot of information about this radiation from unidentified aerial phenomena.
No, you're making a huge leap there. They have certainly had experimentation. You go to NIH would be the place to, National Institute of Health would be the kind of organization that would be doing most of that research. To extrapolate there to aerial phenomena as a UFO is, in my view, just a huge leap. You've got specifically a one-off event. You have a second one that surprisingly has not come up in the conversation, but it's certainly related both in the kinds of event and temporally, and that was Cash Landrum. That happened the same night as at least one of the events at Bentwaters. The guess there, we do know for sure that they were exposed to some kind, and people have hypothesized if it was NEMR or IR or some kind of radiation, but they had symptoms of radiation poisoning, and this is where their story is so convincing, because the severity and symptoms and onset of what happened to Betty Cash and Landrum and Cody is specifically consistent with the story that they told about where they stood as they were observing the craft.
Right. And the boy stayed in the back seat the whole time, right. But the driver got out and walked to the front of the car. She was the one
who got whole body radiation.
Yeah.
And the other was standing behind the door observing, so it was partially blocked. That's why I say the severity of the symptoms is consistent with exactly what they described.
But John, I can't understand your saying that there isn't an absolute direct relationship that is described in 460 pages in this UK report. It is specifically titled Unidentified Aerial Phenomena, and that
because you've got the report and I don't. So that's
I thought you had read it.
I've gone through it, but it's been years since I've touched anything.
Well, it's only been out since 2006.
That's 9 years. So,
I've got a couple questions on that, Colonel Alexander. Number one, when Nick Pope was on last week, and one of the things that he talked about, which, I tried to wrap my arms around this because I understand the conspiracy stuff that's out there. Matter of fact, one of the things that caught my attention a while back was that at one point there was less worry about the fact that some disclosures happened, documents have been released, that there is some evidence to show that we've had some, we've been visited, or however you want to word it. But the biggest worry was what was coming out of it, and the spin that came out of it that would possibly upset people and cause the problems. But getting into that, Nick Pope said that he was one of the people that had the report started in the first place. He said, and within the report it says there's a clear race by obviously the major countries in the world to figure this phenomenon out and to weaponize it. And then it goes into some of the details of what the possible weaponization that could be done from it. And Nick made it very clear that that was what was going on, number one. And number two, then he said, whoever gets this technology would basically control everything, just like what you said about remote viewing or time travel.
Okay, that sounds like a statement.
But what I'm getting at is you've done a lot of research. You went to a lot of different agencies. You talked about the UFO phenomena as it is. But would that not be an interest by our government, the British government, based on what you know about weapons and development of weapons? Would that not be an interest of the governments of the world to do that and to control it? Just like
very limited. Again, you have a situation where you have a small number of people who have some interest. What I can tell you from having been involved in funding issues, remember my last assignment was Director of Advanced System Concepts for the Army, and heavily involved in funding trade-offs and all that. And if you went in, you got a finite amount of money, and what you do is we call rack and stack. You line up all the things that you want to research. And I can tell you, for most scientists, you come up and tell them, I want a stack of money to go research UFOs, you would get laughed out of the room. And the people, I keep arguing that, if it's any large amount of money, they would come after everything. And the assumption would be, if you got money enough to be funding weirdness, you got too much money. We'll just take everything. Let's see. Remember, I was attacked personally in Scientific American over these very topics, where they said that I shouldn't be allowed to spend money without adult supervision, just because I'm even interested in these areas, and that's the general tenor of the organizations that you're going in front of when you're having to justify budgets. Now, having said that, there's always the possibility for small amounts of money to be used if you're below the visible threshold. So you do have people who are interested, like the remote viewing program, $20 million. I don't think that's right. But if you use that and say remote viewing was $20 million over 20 years the program ran, you're talking lunch money. If you look at the UFO phenomena, in my view, we're looking at something that's as complex as cancer or AIDS. So when you start looking at the amount of money that would be necessary to do this kind of research, it would be huge.
Okay, that's fair. Now one other thing into this, though. Okay, let's say you've got the DOD, all right? Then you have private enterprise, okay? And you've got a joint project working where you give it a small amount of funding for the private enterprise to work on it, and if they come back with positive results, they're given more funding. That does exist, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so
remember, the private enterprise you're talking about are the ones who are sucking here. They're the ones who want the money to be provided by the government.
I understand, but they've got to produce results. And we're getting ready to go to a break, but that's one of the things I want to get into when we come after the break, your work with Robert Bigelow and his involvement. But and I'm sure Linda's got more questions. So it's time for break, folks. We'll be right back with John Alexander.
Folks, to find out more on John B. Alexander, visit his website at johnbalexander.com. Also, you can find his latest books at Barnes & Noble and on Amazon, UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies and Realities. Folks, stay with us for more Phenomenon Radio with Linda Moulton Howe, John Burroughs, and special guest John B. Alexander exclusively on KGRAradio.com. Welcome back to KGRA's presentation of Phenomenon Radio right here on KGRAradio.com. Here we are in the last segment of the show, and I give you John Burroughs.
Thanks, Race. Colonel Alexander, when we went to the break, I wanted to get into your work, I believe, with NIDS and Robert Bigelow. Could you kind of summarize? I know when you got out of the military, you went into the private industry part of it. Can you summarize a little bit of your work in NIDS and with your work with Robert Bigelow on Skinwalker Ranch and what exactly you guys were looking for?
Yeah, my next stop, second career, was at Los Alamos National Laboratory, where we were doing that's a GOCO operation. When NIDS was set up, it was designed to look at two specific areas that he had interest in. One was continuation of consciousness beyond bodily death, or the life after death issue, and the other one was UFOs. It may be best known because of what became later called Skinwalker Ranch. It was never that at the time that we were there. But we became aware of a place in Utah, kind of south central, eastern central Utah, that a lot of really, really strange events occurred at. And Bigelow bought the ranch. I was with him at the time. In fact, I was the first one to spend a night up there. After that, it was instrumented, and we had people that would spend a lot of time doing, just observations of the ranch because, and I think it's germane to this, and in the book I've addressed what I call the sentient precognitive phenomena. The point here is that there were many, many different types of events that happened, all of them very, very strange. And it was like something was pulling the tricks. Now, we haven't got to the issue of the trickster, which I think is important in all of these issues. But it seemed like something, kind of a sentient overlord of some kind, was looking out, and it would give us presentations of events. And they would vary from cattle mutilations to disappearances to creepy crawlers coming out of tunnels to, hearing things, smelling things, shooting things, and all of which just defied, classic description.
And wasn't it true that you would try to videotape aimed at areas where there was persistent phenomena?
It was instrumented 24/7. Time-lapse photography, the films would be, and when I say it's a trickster, what would happen is things would happen that should be on camera that weren't. Or if you point the cameras in one direction, it would say, oh, you like that, try this. And it would try something just outside of, the camera range. Like I say, whatever it was definitely in control.
And I was the one who did that interview with Mr. Sherman, that Bob Bigelow was listening to that interview, and I had interviewed him because of the cattle mutilations. And Mr. Sherman and I talked several times during that period when I did the first, the radio broadcast with Art Bell, and then Bob Bigelow, and I guess now I just learned you went with him, but that he was interested in that ranch. And in one of the discussions with Mr. Sherman that was, I believe, not on one of the radio broadcasts, he said that one night they had been having the red mysterious balls coming in and out and around the front of their house that were there quite a bit. And he suddenly felt very angry because he could see yellow, what looked like windows on some sort of a craft through his spotting rifle. And he said, without thinking about the consequences, he ran down from the house toward these yellow windows and got down below something that was hovering above, and that he was screaming at them and raising his fists, and that he could see two humanoid figures that looked to him human, looking down in telepathically. What Mr. Sherman had come into his head were these thoughts: it won't do any good to explain to him why we are here, because he will never understand it. And that was from Mr. Sherman to me back in the 90s.
Okay. Like I said, there were so many events. I guess the best book on this is what Cullum and George Knapp did, called Skinwalker Ranch. I put a few of them in, but they were absolutely bizarre. And of course, one of the main issues, they were very physical. We're not just talking about mental aberrations or weird understandings or sightings. These had physical consequences, so definitely manifesting in physical reality as we know it.
Wasn't one of the phenomena that raised this whole issue of dimensions and travel and transport that there were we'll call them the dark holes that would open up, and something that seemed to be humanoid shape would come out of the black, we'll call it a tunnel or a hole that people...
Yeah, there was one such incident that was observed, and very, very strange. We give it pretty high credibility. What was interesting is whatever came out went running off, and yet the area... Were you ever on the ranch?
No, I was not physically there.
Okay. The point is that the area there was a dusty road, and so therefore there should have been footprints or something, because this was a pretty good size color that came out, and just ran off, and no indications of what it was or how it was there.
So there were no tracks?
No tracks. That's the point. And there certainly should have been. And they both saw the whatever the entity was going out. But what is manifest about all of these phenomena that occurred is that they don't behave, in a manner that we would anticipate, obeying the laws of physics as we know them today. I just did an interview where I said, basically, I think the laws of physics are basically guidelines. They work very well most of the time, but there's other times when we have these incidents that just defy description. This is what when I was in West Africa, chasing voodoo and seeing things that simply can't happen either. One of the things I want to point out that is one of my core issues is the difference in overall belief systems. The point here is that in the Western world, we have this materialistic view, and, we can split things to smaller and smaller particles. We have the Higgs boson and now quarks and whatnot. And so we deal with these phenomena as if they're weird and unusual. That is not true in other parts of the world. Western Europe, yes, but when you get to other areas, they have a very different worldview. And I've argued at the SSE that I think ours is quite limited.
Well, one of the things about the beams, they come up in the human abduction syndrome, a very similar description as what happened on the Skinwalker Ranch, Mr. Sherman's ranch, and that is there will be somebody in bed and they suddenly are awake and they see what appears to be a black oval forming in the center of their room, and out of it come what people call shadow people. They're humanoid and they are shadowy, and then the abductee loses consciousness. On the Sherman Ranch, there was that example of the oval out of which came that entity that could run and not leave tracks. If it is a technology, it appears really to be the same kind of technology, and is their hypothesis that it's point-to-point manipulation of space-time is one, and the second is being able to control space-time in order to travel point to point, backwards and forwards in time. Have you yourself come to any hypothesis about which may be operating in terms of the propulsion or the transportation that happened in RAF Bentwaters, at the Sherman Ranch, in the abductees, where things can point into a room, into a ranch, and seemingly open up?
I think the problem here is you're being selective in the events that you're describing, because there are so many, many more events. And this, by the way, is where I blame the skeptics as well, because what they do is they come up with quick answers that only cover part of the observation. And that's what I think is happening here, is that, those things happen on some occasions, but there's many other examples where that was not. And the same with the beings, what do the beings look like? One of the issues, the slides that I have, is if you talk about entities that, have done abductions or whatever, the variety in and of themselves is problematic. There's just, in my view, too many different kinds of things that are answered. The notion of a specific technology doing it, I'm actually much more inclined to believe that what we're looking at is a role of consciousness of some kind, multidimensional, whatever. But I keep getting back to the trickster, that some external force that is certainly sentient, that is controlling all of these events. When I call it precognitive, my point there would be that it seemed to know how we were going to respond, what we were going to do before the event even occurred. And then every time we would try to adjust and put in new technologies, sensor systems or whatnot, it would say, you like that? Try this. And you would get presented with something quite different. So I have a problem with selecting certain cases and going to, selective examination of these various events. In fact, what I have called for, and have been unsuccessful, is what I think we need to do is a step back issue. Bring in a bunch of smart people who have had these wide range of experiences and have them explain the observation. One of the problems that we have in all of these fields is that we tend to put labels on them very quickly. This was an issue where Bob and I disagreed. What I suggested when we formed NIDS is, let's not have any overall organization. And being an engineer, the first thing he did was draw boxes and says, we got this box and that box and that. And we tend to put these phenomena in boxes, and I don't think they fit. I think we need to be looking at where are the things that are bleeding over? What is it that doesn't fit? And we're not at the point of even asking the right questions yet.
That's fair enough. Now, what I wanted to ask you, when you guys did your study up there, you definitely had equipment up there that evaluated frequencies in EM fields. Did you or did you not?
Right.
Was there changes in EM fields? And I know you called him the trickster. When the trickster showed up, was there changes?
Remember, this was over a period of 6 years, and the events would fluctuate over time. But you would see different kinds. But we did not. The question is there a direct correlation between certain electromagnetic anomalies and phenomena? We did not see that, as far as I know.
Okay.
But that you saw things that happen, absolutely true. And like I say, the reason I like the Bentwaters case, going back to that, is that you have certain physical phenomena that can be relied on, as well as the witnesses. At Skinwalker, similarly, we had very, very physical events. And we had phenomena that when you looked at it, and we tried to logically dissect, Linda talked about cattle mutilation. We had a calf that was mutilated and Terry spotted it within 45 minutes. And the calf, in that length of time, broad daylight, had 20 pounds of something missing from it. It had been exsanguinated. Ear was cut off, mutilated in sort of the classic sense.
Right.
And you go, how do you do that, again, in broad daylight under almost controlled conditions? The position was that whatever happened to the calf happened someplace else.
Yeah, and then abductees have seen animals hooked up to machinery or under a scalpel in the abduction syndrome that would, if those are valid, then they would fill in the gap. And the animals, people in craft have seen animals lowered in beams to the ground. And then I pick up where ranchers have seen beams coming out of something in the sky and have watched an animal be dropped to the ground, and they discovered that it is mutilated. And in one case, there was a rancher in the Sand Springs, Oregon area who watched an animal rise in a beam of light going up into something in the sky, and later it was dropped onto the ground, mutilated. And therefore, there are eyewitnesses that are before, during, and after, if you count the ranchers and the people in the human abduction syndrome.
That's a statement. Yeah,
Okay.
These things happen. But the problem is when you go back and step back and look at all of the things that happen, it gets even stranger.
To you, in what way is the strangest that you experienced in Skinwalker?
I couldn't begin to select one of them. There was so many kinds of things. That calf was one. The one you mentioned with the creepy crawler coming out. We had things in the trees, animals that Terry shot at very close range that just fell and then didn't exist.
Yeah.
The litany goes on and on and on. One of the reasons that he gave up, the ranch was that things were happening. The correlation, it was that when things happened to the cattle, it would happen primarily to his best cattle and not others. So,
which has always been the rancher's complaint in the hundreds that I've investigated.
Yeah.
As a group, when you guys were out there, did you ever see something happen that you both saw differently? Like one thing saw it one way, one saw
about,
right.
And, not personally, but I am aware that, I won't give it away, but one of the people who worked with us seemed to be more sensitive and would get messages when others of us would just kind of stand around and, he's going to, didn't you hear that? I'm going like, no. But certainly some of it was highly directed.
John, in terms of you experiencing on the Skinwalker Ranch that the phenomena was anticipating what you were planning or anticipating future efforts, and
Absolutely.
we get back into this whole issue of past, present, and future. If you can remote view the future, which you have just said, does that imply that the future, like Einstein was puzzled, is somehow locked in and the universe is just evolving along and already their track?
Oh, yes. Free will versus predestination.
Yeah.
The eternal conundrum.
What do you think?
I don't know. I come to where I think free will is probably, at least in some degree, mandatory, but again, you're talking about getting into dimensions. When you start working, we didn't discuss near-death phenomena or altered states of consciousness, but one of the first things that comes up whenever you study that is that our entire concept of time is wrong. when you talk to people who've had NDEs or other out-of-body experiences and things of that nature, particularly in the very important spiritual events, one of the things that they say is no time or space. This does occur, like we discussed earlier with the UFOs, where people had, their experience of time was one thing, the experience of time passage into everyone else was different. But so that does suggest to me that, again, you're back to consciousness as some component of whatever you're dealing with.
And RAF Bentwaters, that whole report is about how the unidentified aerial phenomena, non-ionizing radiation, can affect and influence human minds. And John has a blank. Jim Peniston has a perspective. There are so many different perspectives there. And is it a technology that affected their minds? Condyne would say yes.
Yeah, but Condyne is also, like all the other, I've sat on many of these studies. I've been on studies with the National Academy of Science and all of that. And one of the things you find is the individuals involved always go to what they know and come up with a hypothesis based on, their understanding of it, as opposed to being open to something that's considerably different. And so I'm not in the slightest surprised when I've done a lot of work with non-lethal weapons. And in that arena, invariably, the first thing we would go to is high-power microwaves. They would take on almost mythical capabilities, way beyond what the research would suggest. And, when you don't know what you're dealing with, you start coming up with things that, what's possible. These sorts of things are possible. Again, I think there's something operating beyond simple technological advances, if you will.
And if technologies are involved by something that is advanced or different than we are, but it is a presence on this planet, and you jump back to remote viewer Atwater, who was then working in the Army, you probably knew him. And he did remote viewing that Jim Marrs talks about in great detail in Sci Spies, one of Jim Marrs' books. And it was, according to both Atwater and to Price, who was also doing remote viewing, they were looking at the issue of alien presence on this planet, and they came up with 4 underground bases and said that they were 4 different races or territorial geopolitical presences on this planet. If that's true, then the manipulation of humanity since, let's say, Neanderthal to Homo sapiens sapien could be right below our feet in terms of its not having to travel huge light year distances.
I take the underground aspect as more of a metaphor because, again, I think when you're dealing with consciousness and multidimensionals, where they are doesn't make much of a difference. When you deal with things in the spirit world, people who can communicate with them, they will talk about spirits being, coexisting with us, functioning very well in areas that we just don't see into. Now, these are, great, most interesting hypotheses.
But John, you think before...
I've seen the base literature. The problem is I think people have been to most of them, and physically you don't find anything there.
So it may be other dimensional.
Are they really there? But when you get into interdimensional kinds of things, almost anything is... there are UFO sightings where we haven't talked about, underwater ones or ones where they just fly into the mountains and don't crash.
Well, before we have to sign off tonight, I wonder if you would agree at least on this, that there are likely extraterrestrial intelligences somewhere else in this huge cosmos.
Oh, that's a statistical almost assurance that
Yes.
there's sentient cognitive life somewhere in the universe. I mean, you don't have to believe in any of the weirdness to come up with that probability.
And that extraterrestrials, other dimensionals, time travelers, and underground dimensional presences could all be at work in this very complex 16-level chess game that is humans now becoming aware that there's other consciousnesses around us.
Well, this is why I say, again, I don't think we're at the point of asking the right questions. We keep trying to look for simple answers, and I think it is so complex that even our ability to understand it is stretched.
Colonel, I want to thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time because, like you said, there's so much more to cover. Maybe we can have you back on again sometime. And I want to thank you again for coming on. And Race, take us to next week.
I will do just that. Thank you, John. Next week here on Phenomenon Radio, 14-time Emmy Award-winning journalist and Las Vegas's KLAS news anchor George Knapp will join the show. To find more on the program, visit phenomenonradio.com and earthfiles.com. And if you do Facebook, you can find us and follow us there. For John Burroughs, Linda Moulton Howe, and our very special guest tonight, John B. Alexander, thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned for 3 hours of more live talk radio with Jimmy Church and Fade to Black right here on KGRAradio.com.